So I think we really need to step in as a community of people working on this to share both the information, but also the resources and the mentorship and the training that they need to basically build out solutions that fit their own particular products.
Welcome back to another episode of the Tech Terror Takedown podcast, where we dive into critical issues at the intersection of technology and public safety. I'm your host, Sophia Rothut, researcher at LMU Munich and in the EU Project TATE, and today we have a very insightful episode lined up for you. Our focus today is on the techniques used by extremist and terrorist actors to evade online content moderation. To help us unpack this topic, we are joined by Broderick McDonald. Broderick is an Associate Fellow at King's College London's International Centre for the Study of Radicalisation and a postgraduate researcher at the University of Oxford. Broderick's research bridges the gap between online and offline extremism, leveraging on the ground data collection with new insights about how terrorist groups exploit digital technologies. He previously served as an advisor to the Government of Canada and was a fellow with the United Nations Alliance of Civilizations. Additionally, Broderick serves in the Independent Advisory Committee at the Global Internet Forum to Counter-Terrorism GIFCT and is a research affiliate of the Center for Information Technology and Public Life. Welcome to the podcast, Broderick. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, happy to be here.
Broderick, could you start by explaining why violent extremist and terrorist groups like ISIS or far-right organizations find online platforms so valuable for their operations?
There's two broad reasons. The first is internal communications, which is to say that clandestine organizations need a place to organize, plan, and really build social ties between members. And we know from the last 20 years of social science research on these groups that this is really important. The strength of ties between members and between leaders within the groups is often one of the key determinants of their success and their long-term survival. But it's important to do that in a safe way. And I think that for a lot of these groups, they're facing in-person pressure from either law enforcement or from counterterrorism operations. Online communications become a medium that they can use more safely than meeting in person and building these ties face to face. So within the groups themselves, these technologies play a very important role in really building those ties and that organizational capacity. The second piece of it is what the rest of the world is probably much more aware of and much more visible. And that's really the publicity and the recruitment that these groups do. So they start out as small knit cells and small knit groups, but if they want to expand and they want to recruit members, they have to grow their audience. And this ultimately means publicizing, glorifying their activities, their ideas, their operations, and really attracting attention on social media beyond the usual, list of characters that seek them out. And so to do that, mainstream platforms are the gold standard for these groups. Even if they can use alt-tech platforms to organize themselves internally, getting a foothold on mainstream social media has been one of their key objectives and something they spend a lot of time trying to do. But in order to do that, they have to learn how to basically work within the system and understand content moderation, which is constantly iterating and constantly trying to keep them off of those platforms, which makes for a really interesting dynamic, and I think one that we need to be prepared for as it's constantly changing and shifting over time.
In your research, you observed extremist and terrorist actors, especially ISIS supporters, to adopt modern techniques to channel their content into the mainstream in order to fly under the radar of content moderation. Could you tell us more about the evasion techniques used by these actors to avoid content moderation?
Yeah, there's many different ways that terrorist or violent extremist groups will try to evade content moderation. But what I'll do here is go over a few of the most common ways, just so that folks can really sink themselves into some use cases and see exactly how this unfolds. So the first and probably most common way that we see is these groups will use what I call image obscuration. So this is simply marking up or scribbling on a piece of terrorist or violent extremist content. Could be, for instance, an ISIS flag, or it could be a propaganda poster for an event that a far-right group is hosting. And simply by obscuring the image to such a degree that it looks like something new, this could be, just putting lines over the content, it could be adding an emoji, it could be even posting a smaller version of the same image on top of it. It will help them to get around some of these safeguards. But of course, it's a constantly changing cat and mouse game. So as they try one thing, they're often caught within quite a short time frame. And so that's helped them to move to other, I would say, somewhat more advanced methods. And some of these are also quite innovative too. So we see frequently they will overlay their content with media logos. This was very common with ISIS during the peak of the caliphate days. So as every media organization in the world was trying to follow this group and was trying to provide trusted information about what the group was doing, it was quite common to see a BBC or a Guardian article or news video with the media logo of the BBC or the Guardian in the bottom right-hand corner. IS figured out that if they just took the BBC logo and put it on their own content, it could oftentimes evade some of the detection tools that we use to spot this content. And so I think we need to be really careful when we look at what is actually true and genuine content from trusted news media and what is being essentially mimicked by these other groups. The third piece of it, which is quite unique to each group and it varies a lot, is the use of quotations or even historical figures. So pro-IS accounts will often not even use well-known symbols of the group, for instance, the ISIS flag, but instead they'll use inspirational quotes or infographics or cherry-picked passages of scripture that signify support for their group. They can also use quotations from famous, veteran jihadists, people like Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, Makdisi, Azam, or even historical figures like Ibn Taymiyyah to really tie into the message that they're trying to convey, sometimes on its own and sometimes with an image below. But it's hard to associate, a quote from Ibn Taymiyyah, one of the, the best known Islamic theologians in the world, and narrow that down to a piece of content. The fourth way is through extremist symbols. So this can be something as simple as an upward-facing, index finger, which of course is a symbol used by the Islamic State to signify their unity and their participation in the group. But there's a wide range of other, what I would call visual shibboleths, which are ways to convey, at least to an inside crowd or an in-group, your association or your support or your sympathy for a particular organization. And the far right has many examples of this as well. Similarly and related to that, we see the use of emojis used quite effectively. So oftentimes, it won't be an actual ISIS flag, which is, for those who don't know, it's a black and white flag, but rather just a black flag emoji, sometimes placed beside a upward pointed index finger, or some emojis of weapons, which in some ways looks very harmless and benign, but it's a really effective way for these groups to signal their belonging to the organization. Related to that, we also see the use of leet speak and broken text posting. This is a particularly challenging issue. It's not a new one, but it's one that is challenging because anybody who's worked on leet speak before will tell you it's constantly changing. The lexicon and the dictionaries that are used when an organization adopts leet speak, which is simply replacing one word for another, but it signifies the meaning of it, that is quite clear to anybody in that in-group. And so the challenge with this is if you close down or you identify, one form of leet speak, oftentimes something else will pop up, and it'll be, readily obvious to anyone who is in that group what is being said, but to the outside it can be challenging to crack down on. And the last part of that is just the way that these groups then use these mainstream platforms to tag each other, to share, to use these platforms as kind of a home base, a social hub, if you will, from which they can outlink to more extreme and more dangerous content. So I think that, these two things come hand in hand. You see the evasion tactics, but they're almost always accompanied by either a link to other accounts, or in some cases a link to an external file hosting website or a Telegram page where, if the user wants to go deeper, they can easily access much more dangerous and potentially explicit content from a terrorist group.
Very interesting. Do you perhaps see differences in these tactics between ideologies? That is, do Islamist extremists, for instance, employ other circumvention techniques that far-right extremists do?
Absolutely. I began working on counterterrorism and extremism by focusing on jihadi Salafi groups in the Middle East. And what's been really interesting to me over the last few years is how the tactics have spread across groups and even across different ideologies. So we've often seen far-right extremists learning from and copying the more professional, more developed methods of jihadist groups like ISIS or Nusra or Al-Qaeda. And, this was largely the case because these jihadist groups were much larger, they were more disciplined, they were more professional than, often isolated white nationalists in the US or Europe. But recently, we've started to see that actually shift a little bit. So we've started to see that far-right extremists are, I would say, leading in the experimentation of new technologies like generative AI to get around these kind of content moderation safeguards. And I think this is largely just due to the fact that some of these new technologies are more readily accessible to far-right extremists, who are often based in highly developed economies and OECD countries where they have more access to these tools and more opportunities to experiment with their adoption. But again, we should be prepared to see jihadi Salafi groups also use these groups in the same, or these tools in the same way. It just may come the other way around this time. And I think that, it helps to look at this issue historically. So any kind of terrorist or violent extremist group has always benefited and learned from the experience of others. So if we go back to the origin of ideological groups and we look at the start of Sunni Salafi-Jihadist groups, which adopted the tactic of suicide bombing from the Shia Hezbollah group and first used in Lebanon, we can see that it doesn't matter what the ideology or the political identity of the group is. They will oftentimes steal, borrow, co-opt, whatever you want to call it. They will take the tactics of groups that they may be ideologically very opposed to and then incorporate it into their own repertoire.
Symbols and gestures seem to play a big role in extremist and terrorist communication. Can you talk about how and why these symbols are used online and why they are so difficult to moderate?
Extremist symbols are one of the biggest challenges we face because these symbols are constantly changing and new ones are created by groups that pop up every few months. So it's not just the symbols that you have to keep track of, it's also the new groups that are constantly iterating, constantly changing, sometimes splintering, sometimes forming new groups altogether. And the reality is that there's now thousands of extremist symbols and slogans out there today. I think that more broadly, we can do a better job of keeping tabs on this by actually going after these groups proactively and carrying out OSINT research to try and spot new trends, emerging developments, and then using those insights to better train the content moderation tools so that they're kept up to date. But of course, this is not an easy task. It requires constant investment, constantly keeping on top of these things, and really looking at content moderation in a proactive way, not just a reactive way.
That's a very good point. Let's now look at the content moderation aspect in more detail. What are some of the specific challenges that tech platforms face in detecting and removing such extremist and terrorist content nowadays?
It's one of the most difficult challenges that tech platforms face, but I think it's useful to look at this issue on a technical level. So there's cryptographic hashing, which is what most people are probably familiar with. This is matching one for one. It doesn't copy the material, but it represents it in code. So if somebody was to upload an IS flag or another piece of terrorist content, that would be instantly copied and then saved and then shared with others so that that kind of abuse or harm doesn't happen in the future. But when you get into evasion tactics and modification of images, hiding, subliminal messages in AI-produced images, some of these other evasion tactics that we talked about before, then perceptual hashing becomes a lot more important. Perceptual hashing actually allows you to be adaptive and to really detect content which is similar but maybe slightly altered, and therefore harder for traditional methods to detect. But even with perceptual hashing, there are limits to how far it can go and what it can detect and what it can find. We see many examples of this, and the real challenge, I think, from a technical standpoint is to keep investing in these tools and keep iterating as they improve. But also from a human standpoint, we need to leverage insights from academics, researchers, CV practitioners, people on the front lines to spot these developments and these trends early on, and then keep updating the databases that the models are trained on so that there's not something that catches us basically by surprise. We need to really go on the proactive on this issue and try to find these trends before we're reactively dealing with them on a large scale. And I think that's very possible, but I think it means we need to invest more in human researchers who will always have a role alongside AI content moderation. It's just that we need to actually do proactive research rather than just react to scenarios once we already see them on the mainstream platforms.
Also related to that, do you have tips on how platforms, especially small platforms that maybe lack financial, technical, or human resources, can do to cope with that issue?
Yeah, smaller platforms face huge difficulties with this. Oftentimes they lack the resources for an in-house trust and safety team, and they also have a knowledge gap. They don't know how to approach this in many cases because it's so outside of what they've maybe been doing in an early stage development. So there are some methods that can help them. For instance, Meta has developed a new Hatcher Share tool. Google has its Altitude tool, which are free platforms that any new company can access and use at no cost. But beyond this, we really need organizations like Tech Against Terrorism and the Global Internet Forum to Counter-Terrorism to provide mentorship and assistance for these smaller companies who often don't even know how to get started. I mean, I think this is an information and awareness issue as much as a technical one. There's been an explosion of new AI companies, gaming companies, even new social media companies over the last 5 years. And when I talk to them, many of them have never had a chance to actually think about trust and safety deeply. They're often so consumed with building their product and bringing it to market and being ahead of their competitors, which is, of course, what they have to do to succeed, that they don't oftentimes stop to think really deeply and really thoughtfully about how their tools could be used. And at the same time, when I talk to the CEOs of these companies, they're horrified, to think that their platforms could be used by terrorists or violent extremists. So I think these small companies are not reluctant to engage with this, but there is an information gap where it's something that they oftentimes haven't even thought seriously about. And so I think it's incumbent on all of us really to reach out to founders, to folks at small companies, to VCs, people in our network who are working on these kinds of issues, and just talk to them about it. Let them know that there's tools and resources available from GIFCT or Tech Against Terrorism. There's also actual technical solutions available from many of the larger companies that they can access at no cost. And we really just need to shift the awareness around this issue to put it front and center again.
Looking ahead, what trends do you foresee in the tactics used by online extremists, and how should platforms prepare to address these future challenges?
I think there's a lot of science fiction around AI right now, but we don't need to even look 5 or 10 years into the future to imagine what kind of policy challenges we might face. There's a lot of practical threats right now as non-state actors are learning how to exploit these tools and produce TVEC content, terrorist and violent extremist content that is cheaper and more effective and more scalable than ever before. So we can focus on that while also keeping an eye on the horizon, but we shouldn't just worry about the future and sort of ignore the ways that these tools are already being used right now. When it comes to content moderation, this is the focus of it. These new technologies allow them to basically avoid a lot of the detection methods that we've previously used. And I think that as AI and Gen AI tools become increasingly more sophisticated, we'll see further challenges with that. There's also room for extremists to experiment with evading efforts to stop them from distributing this content. So we should also expect adversarial shift to not just include production, but also distribution in the future. And this is going to require a lot of very careful engagement to think about how we can stop that. But ultimately, I think that whatever form this adversarial shift takes, we need to keep working with subject matter experts to keep that training data fresh and relevant and aware of current trends, not just looking at what's been done in the past, but actually going out proactively and spotting these developments before they reach a sort of critical mass. It might also mean investing in new technical tools like provenance initiatives, C2PA, that can help us to determine the origin of an image. This will help with things like the logo mimicry that we talked about before. If we can tell, at the point of upload where that image has come from and how it's been altered, I think that will give a lot more confidence and a lot of reassurance to both users and the platforms that this is actually a piece of news media and not a sort of mimicked form of propaganda from one of these extremist groups. And then, the last thing I would say is that as the threat landscape shifts and as it changes, we also need to pay attention to the hundreds of small platforms and companies that have popped up, and they don't have the resources to do this on their own. So I think we really need to step in as a community of people working on this to share both the information, but also the resources and the mentorship and the training that they need to basically build out solutions that fit their own particular products. I think this is probably the most important thing right now. If we can focus on getting these smaller platforms to take trust and safety and content moderation seriously, we will prevent a lot of the future issues that we saw with the last round of Web 2.0. I think we've got a unique opportunity now to get ahead of this, but that window is increasingly closing, and so it's something that we need to actually start today and really lead with these companies rather than telling them what to do, talking to them and seeing what they need from us and then helping them to implement it, whether that's through the mentorship program that GiveCT or Tech Against Terrorism offer, or through the technical solutions that some of the larger companies have available.
Thank you so much, dear Broderick, for sharing your valuable expertise with us today. I think it became very clear that the techniques used by extremist and terrorist groups to evade content moderation certainly complicate such moderation processes, which is why I'm very happy that we talked about them today, and also that you provided us with a deeper understanding of how platforms, particularly smaller ones, can better prepare and respond. Also, and crucially, platforms are not alone to deal with it. There is a lot of speed in the development of methods and tactics from terrorist actors, which is why there are and need to be organizations and communities to support from the societal and institutional end to help to build knowledge and to provide hands-on support. For our listeners, I hope you found this episode as informative and thought-provoking as I did. If you have any questions or want to learn more about the topic we discussed today, be sure to check out Broderick's work, such as his article on bespoke evasion techniques published with GNET, the Global Network on Extremism and Terrorism. You will find the link in our show notes. Thank you for tuning in. Until next time, stay safe and goodbye.